bit openly and freely. So my topic is crisis governance in autocratic regime, and I will rely on Hungary as a system which is called hybrid regime or electoral autocracy. I realize this is an interdisciplinary conference, so I don't feel very bad to be a political scientist here, but that's my profession, and I am usually covering issues in political change, ideologies, intellectuals, and political regimes. So I will judge or approach this phenomenon, COVID, also as how a non-democratic regime reacted to the crisis. I will speak about three parts. One is more anecdotal and more sort of auto-anthropological. I think I learned this expression from Muriel. and when the COVID came to Hungary and broke out, a friend of mine decided to bring 7 people together and suggested that this is an unprecedented event in history, a global pandemic, and we have to make a sort of an impact. We have to write something about this for the future generations. So we decided to write a diary. It is called Virus Diary. 7 people, everybody wrote a small article once in a week. So my day was Thursday, other people wrote on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, so there was a full coverage. Started in late March 2020 to go until the end of 2021. And later we published this in a book as a virus diary in Hungarian, and there is translation of English, not the whole book, but several articles. So maybe it's time to do something with those remnants. So I'm not saying that I am an academic observer of this event, but there was a time when we, and I myself, also followed very closely the events of COVID. What is this? How people behave, how the government behaves, etc. So, and how the society behaves, how the government reacts. It is more like a set of spontaneous comments and not an academic book, as I said. And what we saw in the society in those early months was a very troubled reaction, a mix of social solidarity and sort of getting some competitive advantages. The supermarkets were partly closed, partly open. The first 2 hours were open to pensioners and then for working people, and there were some clashes in front of the supermarkets, whether it is now the time for pensioners to go in or it is for working people. So it was a little bit social Darwinism here. So this competitive element, and these little articles also reflected on the mass psychological effects of the pandemic, and also the losses. As we went through the month, it became clear that the government mismanages the situation, and they develop an alternative narrative, and they don't want to speak anything about the losses, about the death figures, and so on. So also some observations, some notes were about the memories of the past, that now we are in a frozen society, we cannot leave our apartments. Some people recalled the days of Kadar regime, the communist regime, when people were controlled very strictly and they could play on the streets only as children, and there was not much chance for public discussion. And also there was a discussion about the rediscovery of private life. So it was interestingly not fully negative. That how beautiful that we can spend more time together, we can go out walking to the streets, to the forests, and the nature, to discover the neighborhood again and being friends with the neighbors, helping each other, etc. And also we discovered, but that is well known, that people were not equally affected by the lockdown. Some people who were anyway working from home, they they didn't see much difference. I had a chance to interview György Spiro, a famous Hungarian writer, who said that nothing changed because he is spending his lifetime anyway at home in his workroom writing books. So he doesn't even know the change of seasons. So some people were untouched by this. By other people, who were running small businesses, they did not receive any help from the government and they suffered a lot. The government was not so much interested in equal and fair help to the people. And we realized retrospectively that after a while we started to deal much more with the government than the pandemic itself, saying that there was no plan. The pandemic revealed a very limited state capacity to handle the problems, and the government figured out some very voluntaristic decisions, removing people from the hospital to give space for the pandemic patients. Other people were very sick actually, but they were just kicked out from the hospital because that was a panic reaction, a moral panic. And they had no comment about the 50,000 deaths, which is a city population in Hungary. And Hungary was pretty bad, probably the third worst on the list among the European countries in treating this regime. So that is just a sort of introduction that non-academically, but as a private person, as a citizen, I really closely watched this situation, and I have a tremendous amount of notes from those days. And the second part of my presentation will cover the reaction of autocracies, and the Orban regime can be called autocracy or electoral autocracy or hybrid regime, whatever you want. Clearly not a classic dictatorship, but also not a democracy. And what this regime liked, to have enemies that they themselves can choose. So they preferred imagined virtual enemies, and they can continuously fight for the Hungarian people against these enemies and winning all the battles. So that was the government propaganda. And these imagined enemies were the Western banks and bankers, the Brussels bureaucrats, and migrants from the Middle East. And it is connected to the Brussels bureaucrats because the Brussels bureaucrats opened the gate to let these people come to Europe. So there is a conspiracy theory here, and the migrants can come. And also George Soros was an enemy, public enemy number one for a couple of years. And by George Soros, you could see a trope of a person, his face, and that was also a hidden anti-Semitic propaganda in that sense, that there is a collaboration between the Brussels EU elites and George Soros to open the borders in the east of Europe, let those Muslim migrants come to Hungary. So actually this is a Jewish-Muslim conspiracy against Hungarians, which was politically interesting because he could tackle anti-Semitism and Islamophobia at the same time. And both parts received what they wanted to have. And finally, after 2022, the Ukrainians and Volodymyr Zelensky, and Ukraine was presented as the enemy. So these were the imagined enemies, because these were not real enemies, but this is what Viktor Orbán liked in order to always present himself and his regime as the winner. But in 2020, suddenly there was a real danger, a real enemy, the COVID-19. So that was existing, real, undeniable, invisible, how to combat, you don't see the virus. It was unique, never happened before in such a scale, and it was global. There was no recipe, no protocol for the defense, so the regime was really in trouble. How an authoritarian regime can strengthen its grip on the society, maintaining power, and in the meantime, in terms of public policy, they treat the crisis properly. And that was a real trouble for the regime what to do, because they always promoted loyalty, party loyalty, loyalty to the leader, vis-a-vis expertise. So experts, professionals were sort of hidden communists, hidden liberals, part of an international conspiracy against Hungary. So expertise was presented very badly by the authoritarian-minded regime, and somehow they created their own reality for themselves, and imagination, an imagined community versus reality. And when they faced reality, it was interesting. They did not want to really say that, okay, now we have a real problem and now we are now taking it seriously, and that is reality. But they reconfigurated, reimagined reality. Which reality? And they presented an alternative reality in their narrative, claiming that when the nation is in trouble, then there is even a higher need for a centralized, powerful, reliable leadership. So that was used for further centralization of the executive power, marginalization of the parliament, disregard to rule of law, which existed already before, so no surprise, and elimination of the remnants of the voices of the opposition and civil society, and strengthening the rule of emergency, the state of exception. So Giorgio Agamben wrote a famous book on the state of exception. Of course, they did not refer to Agamben, not even Carl Schmitt, which could have been another obvious example. But the point is that the state of exception existed in Hungary since 2015. So he was in power from 2010, and after 10 years he introduced the state of emergency vis-a-vis the Muslim migration from the east, saying that now the country is in danger, erecting fences and doing again nothing policy-wise, just opening the western border and let these people go to Austria and Germany, using this Willkommenskultur of Angela Merkel. So actually the regime did nothing to strengthen European solidarity and taking a fair share of the burdens, but just passing the problem to Germany. So the regime existed as a state of exception since 2015, and it was just simply renamed the emergency situation in 2020, referring to COVID now. Because of this pandemic, we have to have a stricter measure for emergency, and after 2022, they again renamed the emergency, referring to the war in Ukraine. So Hungary is the only country in the European Union which lives continuously in the permanent state of emergency since 2015 up until today. Even after the election, it is not eliminated immediately. Formally, the transfer of power did not occur, so there is a state of emergency even at this moment. So, The other thing what the government did was strengthening the state oligarchs around the prime minister, ordering healthcare instruments, ordering vaccination from China, from Russia, arguing against Pfizer and the British. What was the name of the British vaccine? AstraZeneca. So they said, well, these are the Western, and but the Russian, I don't know, Sputnik or what was the name, is more effective, just not to speak about the Chinese. So actually, healthcare instruments, the problem was for the society that now they face the sorrow state of the institutions of healthcare. It became crystal clear that the state incapacity is widespread, and they just simply don't know what to do. And finally, one can ask the question why people trust the experts in Hungary. Of course, one can ask, check out the alternatives, it's even worse. But somehow, historically, back to the regime change of '89, concepts like expertise, competence, professionalism, they became positive notions in Hungary and positive political notions. Those notions, those concepts became politicized. Why? Because the late communist regime was non-ideological, and communists wanted to escape from any ideological legitimacy, which collapsed anyway. So the left abandoned from their traditional values of solidarity and equality and stuff like this. Escaping from ideology, they claimed that we are experts, and already in the 1990s, when they could come back to government, they advertised their campaign by saying, let the expertise govern. So vis-a-vis these amateurish, populist, nationalist moonwalkers, these lunatics who don't know how to govern. So they use this legacy of non-political politics or anti-political politics against the nationalist, authoritarian right wing. And this was based on the so-called neutral idea of modernization. There is a classic theory of modernization, how to develop, and that was connected to the modernization ideology in the 1920s to justify the rule of the left liberal coalition. We are the modernizers, and those are the backward-looking communitarians. So that worked pretty well. And the non-ideological, technocratic left. It was a defensive and unimaginative, but it survived another decade until 2010, when Viktor Orbán came power and came the regime. And the Orbán regime was offensive, aggressive from the very first moment, but also very creative and imaginative. So developed a new populistic narrative, and people were taking it because they got only this sort of boring technocratic discourse for decades as a language of democracy. And Orbán wanted to say that the real democracy is when you give back the power to the people. And now forget about the rule of law, forget about the institutions like Constitutional Court and all these technicalities. Let's have a direct link between the leader and the people, and this is a direct democracy. So Orbán sold autocratization as democratization in the first couple of years. So in that sense, this was imaginative and creative, but also there was a continuous destruction of institutions for national belonging, so also the rise of the leader. And then here in 2020, the COVID pandemic offered the chance for people to act and refer to rationality and act on behalf of rationality. So, and that was a chance for them to come back and make the regime face the reality. But as I said, the regime developed its own narrative of reality. So the reality check did not really work. And also many people believe that now maybe this is an opportunity that the regime will wake up and will pay attention to experts' opinion, to the doctors and others, and not just living in its own bubble, its own propaganda narratives. But it's interesting that in the Western countries they also introduced emergency measures. They could do with good reason, because they were democratically legitimized governments. So they could say to the people that, look, you have to suffer now for a while, and then we will lift those restrictions and we return to normal democratic operation. But in Hungary, it could not be said, because there was no normal democratic operation before. So what they did is to say that, well, maybe you have to discipline yourself, but Orbán was ambivalent whether schools should be closed or not. There was even football games during the COVID large scale under Orbán, because he likes it very much. So he was ambivalent because he had some successful populistic innovations and he didn't want to give it up, because he knew that his rule is not legitimized by the will of the people in the lack of democratic elections. So he had an ambivalent position. Okay, let's behave more disciplined, but also let's return to normalcy. Interesting that he was not very rigid on this, but it is not because of the democratic legitimacy, not because of, like Sweden, that until we reach the herd immunity we can go together outside. So nothing like this. He was like just maneuvering around the political opportunities. And as somebody said, that unfortunately the COVID had not much memory among the voters, and Fidesz won the elections in 2002 based on an anti-war position and the outbreak of the war in Ukraine after the Russian aggression. So people did not speak about COVID despite the losses, despite the death of family members. So there was a COVID silence after 2022. People talked about Ukraine and the war and other things, but it was very quickly forgotten on the surface. But, and this is my last sentence, but the mismanagement of the COVID pandemic was in the collective memory afterwards. It was slow to understand, but people finally understood, and that collective experience contributed to the moral decline of the regime, which ultimately led to its political collapse in 2026. So I think it is one of the indirect reasons, not a direct reasons, but there are several indirect reasons which led to the change of the regime.
Thank you, András. Thank you. So we move on to our second speaker, Tietze, who is our resident emergency psychiatrist, who we may want to come and see at the end of this conference. From Australia, living in Hamburg, with an interest in anti-politics. So.
And I have to wait till Muriel comes back. Okay. She has ordered it. Could I ask you to give me a warning at 15 minutes and then at 20?
I will do that.
Okay. And I'll just wait till Muriel. Okay. And I'll set up my PowerPoint. Just mainly for illustration. Great.
Yeah. Coffee. Ah.
She's feeding her addiction. I have a few.
You can't even start with it.
She told me I was going to ask.
Ah, really?
Can I start now, Mum?
Yes.
See, I have money.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Thanks first of all to Muriel for this amazing conference, which has just filled my head with stuff and made it really hard to pull together a talk after hearing all the amazing things from everyone else. So, where do I work? Oh, it's one of those things. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the issue of the legitimacy of the COVID response and why society was willing to take this on in those circumstances. And you've got to remember, like I said up to a few times, this is one of the most unprecedented intrusions of government into not only social life, but everybody's private lives that goes beyond other sort of threats to liberal and democratic rights. And government's ability to impose these COVID regimes for long periods with seemingly high levels of public support, very weak dissent in most places, has raised fears that these kinds of regimes are going to be able to be a new form of governmentality that can just be wheeled out for other reasons. For example, like the discussion yesterday about the far right. And people see this as linked to a whole bunch of tactics and methods that governments use to be able to support this. Some which I've talked about their fear tactics, propaganda, etc. By way of contrast, I'm going to actually argue that whatever the individual effectiveness of any of these sort of instruments of this new governmentality in legitimating these huge radical social experiments, they were actually deployed in a very specific social context and a set of mass behaviours that actually made them possible and made their effectiveness possible. So I'm going to go back to the immediate pre-COVID period when I just finished a second draft of a book that still isn't published because COVID interrupted everything, where I had actually written a book about how Western liberal democracies, the political elites were suffering a severe crisis of political authority over the societies that they governed. I based my book on Karl Marx's materialist method, which he famously said, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. So I was starting from a very materialist point of view, but I was also looking at two wider frameworks. First of all, Marx's own critique of politics that is sort of largely concentrated in his early writings, which you can get on a very obscure book published by the obscure publisher Penguin. He argues in that there is a separation and antagonism between society and the state that is produced by capitalism. And I also based on this amazing book called Ruling the Void by the late Irish political scientist Peter Mayer, who talked about the hollowing out of the social bases of political parties across the West, such as that they now found themselves ruling this void. This he described as a relationship of mutual detachment and hostility between politicians and citizens. So paradoxically, immediately before COVID, we seem to find the opposite of what we would expect for a mass social experiment by government and politicians that millions of people assent to and even, in many cases, actively support. So there's like a huge paradox here, isn't there? So what was the political context of that period of time? Well, there was this withdrawal of political elites and publics from each other. There were trend declines in voter turnout, party allegiance, party membership of associated organisations, decline in trust in parties and political institutions, electoral volatility, political crisis, the rise of populist challenges. The old left-right distinctions seemed to be much less important than they had been. And political classes started to resort to cartel arrangements. Opposing parties would get together to ensure that they could alternate in power or do deals in power, not so worried about what democratic control might be about. And the voting public and democracy were increasingly seen by political elites as a problem to be managed, hopefully in a quiet corner somewhere. What was behind this? Well, I think there was a very important social context. There had been a long-term decline in associationism in civil society. Trade unions, community organisations, business associations, sporting clubs, churches, you name it, were all in chronic decline over decades, many decades, some going back to straight after the Second World War. Mass media have become increasingly the way that politics came to us, but also took up more of our personal lives. And there was the rise of new technologies that allowed less in-person communication and organisation of society. And so there was this thesis called the bowling alone thesis, that now people were so atomised they really had no social connections or capital with each other. And amongst this, you also got these outbreaks of mass collective protest of a new type, where people are saying we need a new type of democracy. This is no longer working for us. From the Spanish protests, in the Eurozone crisis, through to the Yellow Vest protests in France. On the other hand, we also got the rise of these kinds of things, culminating in 2016, that moment of collective, everybody losing their marbles over what happened, where Brexit and Trump both happened. So, what happened? Well, that context actually allows us to understand what happened really well, why the public and the political classes acted the way they did. On the one hand, ordinary people found much more, they became increasingly anxious about this virus, which was of uncertain threat for a period of time very early on. And with the decline in those social institutions, there was no longer anyone to sort of say, well, let's do something to mobilize society, to make sure it's resilient and so on. It was kind of just this vacuum. Even the scientific experts were divided amongst each other, not sure what to do, changing their line all the time. Those very early months. And so you get this rally around the flag effect, which is really fascinating, where actually all kinds of trust in politics and institutions, right, this is Australian data, I'm going to use a lot of Australian data, rises in the months even before governments take any actions. Particularly strong in Australia, where it had been at all-time lows because the newly elected centre-right government had just had a huge crisis over bushfires, over the mismanagement of bushfire catastrophe, and they were, all institutions were in the pits. So they had these amazing sugar hits of authority. And these sugar hits occurred almost everywhere without politicians actually having anything clear to do. And they were increasingly paralleled by what I think is an understandable desire by people to retreat to the presumed safety of the private sphere where they might avoid infection and death. And then the Wuhan lockdown started to be a bit of a template in the popular consciousness, but also for the politicians. And of course, it turned to a panicked retreat in many places, as we found out with the lack of toilet paper. So even before decisive action or bold political leadership could happen, people were retreating. And then the Western governments started to act. First of all, Italy, late February, partial lockdown in the north, then a full lockdown, and by the 9th of March, a national lockdown. A few days later, Trump, the travel ban on Europe, which is an unprecedented block on travel. And so what we see then is actually in that period, and we remember all this Apple mobility data we also used to look at the time, people actually retreated in most places prior to any lockdown order being made. There might have been some restrictions, some guidances, but people actually ran away from the public sphere and into private life, ran away from public spaces as quickly as they could. Interestingly, in most places, once the lockdown is announced, people start to come back. It's almost like, oh, the lockdown's been announced, I can get out there, it's safer now. And so we have this kind of situation. So it's my argument that you can't understand in almost every Western liberal democracy, you cannot understand how these lockdowns could have been legitimate unless you first understand that people themselves in their millions retreated to the atomistic private sphere, and that gave a social weight and legitimacy to all the policies that followed. And it also helps us understand why every class in society lost their crap and retreated at first, even though the differential effects of what would happen would be vastly different for different social groups. What happened afterwards, though, I'm going to point the finger at a specific group in society, the established political classes or political leaders in most societies. Because what could have been a temporary social retreat and regroupment instead turned out to be a prolonged process. This sugar hit of revived political authority meant that political classes were like, I couldn't believe their luck. They were going to ride this for all that it was worth. And for them, what they needed to show was that it was their action that was keeping the virus under control, their orders and so on. Of course, the problem is when people are already complying voluntarily, or not even complying, they're just doing it voluntarily, you have to keep getting ahead of them to show that you're in charge and the leadership. So each time, the vast majority comply, the tiny minority are singled out as the problem that's ruining it for everyone else. When 95% of people comply, well, you need to get that 100% target. And when the curve has been flattened or cases have bottomed out, elimination or zero COVID is the new target. In Australia, it was really crazy over the vaccines, for example. There was a botched vaccine rollout. people were clamouring to get the vaccine. The government announces harsh mandates if you don't get the vaccine. It was crazy. Like, people were desperate to get the vaccine, but they were being told, we've got to impose a mandate so you will get the vaccine. And of course, this period of sugar hit of authority helped a whole bunch of other people become superstars. The scientific hangers-on, but also business hangers-on, media hangers-on, sports stars, influencers, whoever could hang on to that authority and make themselves part of this wave of revived authority was going to get in there and was going to say whatever they needed to say. Some of these people are some of the people who made the most angry, scientists who said the most ridiculous crap during the pandemic in Australia. And the final addictive element, I think, for established political elites was that this was finally a way to leverage against the populists, for whom Trump was the ultimate avatar of the populist threat. So after all those preceding years of problems that they'd had, suddenly the empire was feeling like it was well and truly striking back. Now, the nature of the regime meant that that actually what had happened was not a mobilization, despite all the talk and claims about social solidarity. It was an atomized retreat into an atomized private sphere. It was a retreat from social life into private life, eventually managed by the state. All those hollowed out social institutions, from churches to unions to whatever, not only did they not mobilize an alternative, they mostly capitulated or even advocated for individuals staying at home, even though it actually further eroded their own social relevance. You'd be happy to know that the football leagues in Australia were one of the few holdouts, and their social relevance was maintained. And any plans to organise assistance for the vulnerable soon fell apart because, from community activists and so on, because actually everyone had to stay at home and be atomised. You couldn't go out and help people because you had to be at home because that was the responsible thing to do. Now, all those things I talked about, mediatised propaganda that inflated the dangers of the virus, the marshalling of scientific authority to marginalise dissent, the deployment of these nudge behavioural interventions in some countries, the disciplining effects of these dramatic state powers, repressive measures, they all carried weight because actually they just aligned with where society had already gone. It was a self-reinforcing loop. And then governments and reserve banks, of course, threw money at the problem to prevent a complete social collapse. And all the bizarre, inconsistent, and rapidly shifting ideologies that justified the equally bizarre, inconsistent, and rapidly shifting regimes, and mostly these were framed in biomedical jargon and often inverted and often inverting long.
Well, but take your time because anyway.
Yeah, and often inverting long accepted meanings. These could seem coherent. All these ideologies could seem coherent because they matched the social retreat that individuals had already staged. They spoke to people in their real state. And the naturalization of the regime, the idea that it was the virus rather than conscious policy decisions that robbed people of work, learning, play, intimacy, that was part and parcel of the same process. With millions stuck at home, their only connection to society, watching the daily politician-run briefings, didn't we love those? It's little wonder that their worldviews were so strongly shaped by political rhetoric and actions that were designed to reinforce this new social reality, which they had, as individuals, kind of led. Now the problem, of course, was that these COVID regimes were full of internal contradictions and tensions. While they were all supposed to be following this monolithic science about the virus, they soon devolved into these wildly varying pathways, depending on specific situations, needs, and interests of those who were running them. In Australia, there were so many state-federal tensions, for example, that led to competitions between politicians over who was running the best border controls, the best quarantine hotels, the best app-based surveillance and tracing systems, the best masking rules, the best vaccine mandates, and of course the best lockdowns. Victoria always won, by the way. Yes, and all these tensions could be withstood as long as the government appeared to control the virus and the citizens complied with that plan, at least in the large majority. And even small protests against the restrictions had to be harshly punished because there was such a desperate need to demonstrate the enforcement of near total compliance. In Australia, no social movement capable of breaking the regime emerged, but I'm aware in other countries there were localised social movements, like in the US, over school closures, and in some places mass flouting, more passive flouting of rules. And that led, in some places, to a quicker opening up than in Australia. But of course, eventually, that sugar hit of authority, of trust in the government, started to go off. So even in 2021, you can see a decline in Australia, despite the fact that people are dutifully still following the rules for the large majority. And the breaking point then was what was called the Omicron strain of COVID, and it ripped through like a 95% vaccinated population. And suddenly, most of the state leaders came on television and said, yeah, it's good. We've declared victory. It's fine. Here's that Victorian premier for you, declaring victory. It's all good. We're going to wind it down. And they kind of just came off and disappeared. The one state leader, my state leader, who actually made a principled argument about why the lockdown should end, actually was hit badly in the polls for saying it. So could this happen again? Which is really the big question. I've pointed to a very specific set of circumstances. A large-scale panicked retreat from society where there's a decline in social institutions and politicians and governments desperate to ride a rise in authority. But what have these regimes left behind? A society even more afflicted by the processes that laid the ground for this in the first place. More atomization, weaker and less credible social institutions, a wide range of social actors tarred by association with the negative effects of the pandemic response. So you can see Australia's trust bubble has burst. These are, you can see that there are all these peaks in 2021, and then it starts to go off, and it's gotten even worse since then. And now the political landscape is even more prey to electoral volatility, more prey to populist revolts and party collapses, as well as the dramatic weakening of all kinds of authority. This has been followed by the inflationary spiral, which strangely couldn't be explained by the huge throwing of money at the problem during the COVID years. But it has even turned lots of supporters of the old regime against the governments that had instituted those regimes. And so we have this new landscape where there's a fear that leaders are lying to us. It just keeps rising and rising since those years. So I'm going to finish with this. Rather than seeing this worsening of the crisis of politics as a reason to get depressed, I want to propose that there's another side to this, in that the last decade has provided further evidence to all of society that politics as it has existed for 2 centuries, as a separate sphere inhabited by an elite who rule over the rest of us, is not fit for purpose in advancing the social interests of the vast majority of people. If politics has both lost and trashed so much of its legitimacy to maintain its rule, perhaps these painful learning experiences can be a reason that society can look to its own resources for addressing collective social problems. Rather than social retreat followed by suppression, while looking to politics and the state for the solution, addressing the next crisis could then be a reason for collective social mobilisation.
20 minutes. I thought it was a wonderful presentation of politics and anti-politics. So I'm sure we will have lots of questions. Milan.
Yeah, I have a question for Todd. I was always wondering why there was so little opposition to these harsh lockdowns in Australia, and I think similar to also in New Zealand, and partial Canada. So these countries were led by liberals. Such a low level of opposition, which is hardly comparable to countries including Britain, the United States, and European countries. So, what's your explanation for this fact that even though it's extremely harsh, and the measures for me as coming from Eastern European countries was something, beyond any imagination. This kind of pressure was not even imaginable here.
Shall I collect, or do you want to answer this right away?
Why don't we collect a few?
Collect a few, okay. Sandra.
Okay, question for Professor András Bozóki. Good pronounce.
Yes,
Okay.
perfect.
Thank you for presentation, really interesting. I was wondering, because you said that in Hungary there was a state of emergency since 2015. and then always the reason was changing depending on the current situation.
Yes.
So my question is, the state of emergency is usually something that by the constitution has to be temporary. So it's limited by time. When you announce it, it can be like, I don't know, usually it's like 90 days, 3 months or something like that. So how the government did that for 5 years, which mechanisms were applied? Did they change the law, like how they define the state of emergency, or what they did? Because I guess that it's the same in Hungary, because it's usually the case, right? It has to be time limited, then you have to announce the new one, but you have to justify it. So.
Yeah.
Thank you, Giovanna. Should we take one more? Yes.
I have a question for András as well. Can you please say more about this very intriguing thing that you said several times, which was that in Hungary apparently there was no mention of deaths, and I feel like what we experienced.
No mention of
deaths.
Yeah.
You said that the government didn't want to talk about deaths, they were ignoring the deaths and so on. And you said this a number of times, and I think my memory of the UK, for example, was almost the opposite, that every day there were announcements about the deaths of the day, and today this many, and today this many, and today this many. So it sounds like it was completely the opposite. So I was wondering if you could say more about that.
Should we leave it at that? Yeah, do you want to answer those to start with?
Yeah. Well, that's the $64,000 question. I think there's a number of things. One is that Australia, for whatever reason, at first had quite a low rate of infections and deaths. The border policies were extremely tough, including between states, as I found to my chagrin. And so there was a kind of a greater wave of success that I think the politicians could apparently play off in that initial period. I think there's a second thing culturally in Australia. Australia is kind of joked about as the nanny state. So it's a state where, I live in Germany now, and I feel much more liberated than in Australia, to give you an idea about the rules in Australia. But it's a different way that rules are done in Australia. Unlike in Germany, where people kind of have an internal sense, you've got to abide by the rules even when no one's watching most of the time. In Australia, people want to break the rules, but there is a state and authorities that are constantly trying to find people breaking the rules and punish them for breaking those rules. And there are more and more rules and more safety measures all the time. So I think it fit with a cultural trend. In Australia, social movements have never been particularly strong. It's just, there have been strong social movements, but if you compare it with some other countries, it's not as spectacular as, nothing's as spectacular as May '68 has ever happened in Australia. And there's been a lot, it was a society that was set up as a penal colony, and the state was dominant in society from the start. So I think there are cultural reasons for that. But I think then it was tied together with a success. I think initially Canada had quite a lot of success as well. Now, Australia's success, I don't think is entirely due to the policies. There's something about Asia. There were other countries that were much laxer in Asia that for some reason also didn't have horrific outbreaks. And it might be to do with the fact that the original SARS-CoV had already circulated through Asia and Australia.
It could be seasonality. It was the summer when it started, so it didn't spread so quickly.
Yeah, but even then, it never really spread very quickly, except in the final Omicron wave in 2021. So yeah.
Can I jump in? Well, how about New Zealand? Does it have this penal colony mentality too? Because it was very strict as well, wasn't it?
I grew up in New Zealand. I can tell you the British colonial state was equally formative to the society there. So there's just I'm not sure about Canada though. I can't speak to that. But I think the other thing was New Zealand had spectacular success, didn't it? Because it completely shut out the rest of the world, and they had hardly any cases for very, very long periods of time. So they appeared to be the zero COVID darlings. So I think those things affect stuff. But I think, there's other countries in the world where there were low levels of protest as well. It's often just like a bunch of dumb luck coming together. So I don't want to say that I have a grand theory, because in the end there were protests, and they were violent, very violent, violently repressed protests. And in fact, some protesters were very violent. compared to other Australian protests because of the severity of the oppressive regime.
Thank you, Todd. András?
Yes, thank you for the questions. Well, it's a very valid question how a state of emergency can survive for 6, 7, 10 years. Absolutely normal people ask this question. And I think that is the irony about the regime, when if we want to imagine the consolidation of this type of autocratic setup, we can say that, well, that was a permanent state of exceptions, the permanent state of emergency, which is a contradiction in itself. It's an irony. They treated this as a technical question. They had the two-third majority, constitutional majority. They could change the constitution anytime. So indeed the law prescribed that after every 6 months you have to renew the state of emergency, but it was not a problem. They come together every 6 months and said, yes, there is a state of emergency, yes, we're voting for that. So it was a very technical, they did not have to justify it in detail. Two-third majority gives unlimited opportunity on this issue. So every 6 months they renewed between 2015 and up until today. Last time, I think last December, it was renewed. And no mention of that. Yes, I was thinking about it in the meantime. The state was shying away from this, but a lot of civic organizations still were talking about the death figures. So it was part of the discussion, but it was never initiated by the officials or by the governments. They said that this is a particularly hard situation, we have to come together, we have to be strong now, and we realized that the situation is serious. But they avoided to speak about numbers and figures. And on the other hand, they also, when they heard some figures, they said these are exaggerations.
Oh, really?
I don't know where did you pick this data. It's probably wrong, false, fake news.
Okay.
Fake news. This is one of those new notions that Orban learned from Trump. So fake news. He repeatedly mentioned fake news.
Which means
and by the way, the manipulation of numbers was part of the story. Sometimes the hospitals also put all the dead bodies as victims of COVID, and others said that, well, maybe they would have died anyway, so it is just statistical, manipulation, and the government introduced this notion that basic sickness. So maybe those people did not die due to the COVID, so the real figures are much lower. It is just the propaganda of the opposition, these high figures. It's much lower because people were sick anyway, and they would have died anyway, so what's the problem? So it's not the problem of COVID.
So what about evening news, for example? Was there like a sort of everyday death count on evening news?
There was a spokeswoman of the government, but she, as far as I remember, I did not make a research on this. She was put there to represent the scientific knowledge, something. But basically, she served as a loyal government official.
So. Can I abuse chair's privilege here? Because there's an interesting comparison, I think, in Tanzania. So Tanzania was one of the few countries which the President Magufuli denied, basically was pretty much a COVID denier, and was an authoritarian leader. And it's interesting because I know people who were in Tanzania, and it was almost the reverse of everything we've talked about here. So anybody who had COVID had to hide it because COVID didn't exist. And there were people, getting hold of tests. It was like a black market, and so you had to continue as if there was no COVID. It didn't exist, and so my learning is that all leaders took authoritarian decisions which suited whatever they decided to do.
Yeah.
So in Hungary it was that. In Tanzania it was this. In other places it was something else. But it depended on. It was all an exaggeration of authority in whatever the context.
Can I ask András a question?
Yeah.
Your discussion of the opposition interested me. I'm curious that the opposition seemed to still have a relationship to expertise from what you were saying. Did that mean that their opposition, because there were oppositions in the West as well, that would say, we are opposed to what the government is doing with these lockdowns, because these lockdowns should be harsher, there should be more fear in the population, people should be warned more about the problems, there should be greater reporting of deaths. There should, like in Australia, many journalists saw themselves as the opposition, because it was a centre-right government at the national level, saw themselves as the brave opposition to the government's completely lax approach to COVID. And they wanted more experts to tell the government to make harsher measures, to lock people down more, to close the borders harder, to restrict people harder. Was this a liberal opposition that was actually, like in those situations, screaming for more liberal measures than even Orban was
good question, because I said, as I said, Orban was ambivalent to this. He wanted to discipline the population, but also give them a little life in the public sphere. As a populist, he wanted, like, people should go to pub, have some beer, etc. So, and in that sense, the opposition was more sort of consequential, that, you know, take it seriously, believe in science, it is really not a joke, it is serious. And they attacked Orban on the ground, they are very tiny, on the ground that the government is irresponsible. So they have some regulations, but they don't take their own regulations seriously. So indeed, they did not attack that, you know, let's liberate more people, but you know, let's put security first, and then all other things as secondary. Yes.
It's like Boris Johnson, really.
And those were liberal opposition. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for each. For András, I was wondering if there was something like with the Czechs, like this, what Milan described, and Marianne as well, this kind of a feeling of, first of pride for having so little in the beginning because we're so good, followed by national depression, we are so bad like always. You know, did anything like this happen also to Hungarian public opinion outside of Orban himself and his circles? And for Ted, you were an emergency psychiatrist during the worst of it. Well, during the worst of the lockdown, because there was no worst of COVID, certainly not at the time, because there was almost no COVID.
But later, I was an emergency psychiatrist when we had our big wave and there was a long lockdown.
Okay, yeah. So my question is, what did you see? What you know? What did people? What kind of problem did people have?
Take any more questions? Yeah, Matt.
Yeah. So just for András, I wondered if COVID came up explicitly in the recent election campaign. Was it an argument that the opposition made against Orban, or was it
in the current campaign this year?
Yes, this one. Was it a theme? And then Tad, in your presentation, science seems to play a kind of quasi-phenomenal or secondary role in the story. What do you think about that? What role do you give to science? Did science have a kind of independent authority, or was it just a tool that politicians were using?
Okay, let's come to those questions.
I might start with your question, Max. You would have seen how much I downgraded science, and part of the reason was very early on. My friend who I talked to most about this, we tried to sort through: is this a return to some form of technocratic rule, where scientists are put in charge to make, even if they're not being value-free, to make ostensibly value-free decisions that government will follow? We pretty quickly decided the only place that was kind of had that institutionalized was Sweden to some extent, where there was actually some separation with the technocratic scientists. I think the thing is that certainly scientists played a real role, and in some places they undoubtedly pushed politicians to do things. But ultimately, I look at where centres of power are in society, and I don't think scientific institutions have the same power as the state. And it was their relationship to the state, whether it was on the inside as the experts pushing the agenda and helping to justify the agenda. On the outside, like some of the people you saw on that screen, were not friendly to the government because they wanted harsher lockdowns. I remember one of those scientists coming on morning television saying, well, what we really need is roadblocks on every intersection to stop people moving between streets. And it was just like crazy. We need the military to come in at this stage.
Yeah.
So there were, I saw them as political entrepreneurs. And I think that's because scientific institutions are pretty scattered, and some of them are powerful, financially powerful, but they don't, like all other associations in society, they're not as well coordinated either through politics or through other organisations as they used to be. It's the same with businesses. Businesses largely approach this. Of course, there are business lobby groups. Their power is tiny compared with the past. So that's why I focused on the political, I think. The second question, what did I see in Australia in the hospital? There were crazy rules that changed every day, largely based on the last press conference of the Premier, which was then and Health Minister, which was then transmuted into the local leadership of the infection control team, making a whole new bunch of pronouncements every day that contradicted yesterday's pronouncements. There was a lot of that. So it felt so unscientific in that sense, even though in our hospital, it was definitely medical scientists making these decisions after watching the latest broadcast, of course. Because there actually wasn't even like a clear communication inside the health department most of the time. The other thing I noticed is that lots of mental health patients stayed away. So we were really quiet we were not as quiet as other specialties, but we were pretty quiet. Some people really freaked out. A really big bunch of crystal meth eventually got through to some of the areas we had. So we had a lot of drug-induced psychosis a bit later on, and so there were all these kinds of things. What did happen on the wards is that as time went on, the restrictions on the wards became more and more terrible. We had to wear masks in front of our patients. For some periods, the patients had to be masked. Doing a mental state in psychiatry is a key part of the diagnosis. And if most of your patient's face is obscured, you can't really do it very well. Yeah. So there are all these things. I mean, getting rapport with patients with masks on when they're psychotic or whatever, like, it's just impossible. So there's a lot of cruelty. And then there were the vaccine issues, where actually relatives were not allowed to visit locked up patients if they didn't have the vaccine. And one guy was stuck in hospital for 6 weeks, could not be in the same room as his elderly father, but we couldn't discharge him because he was not safe to go home to his elderly father. It was just horrible. So I was, look, and I guess I'm just going to make a personal reflection. That is a really big ethical bind if you're wanting to look after patients. Like, we're used to ethical binds in psychiatry because we have the power to lock people up temporarily and so on. But in these situations, I followed the rules because otherwise I would have just been sacked or disciplined or whatever. However, I made very clear to patients always that this was not me endorsing any of these rules. And I think that was the line. But I also didn't want to say I oppose the rules and I'm going to go fight management. We did actually fight management over several things. That elderly father was eventually allowed to visit despite his lack of vaccine, but it was just a horrible situation.
I have two follow-up questions, if I may.
Afterwards.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
How long did it take since the beginning of the measures until you really start to see the influx of people who just couldn't bear it? That's one thing. And second question is, I'm always fascinated by this management. It's the same problem we have everywhere. Like, the management imposed rules that everybody knew to be stupid or really counterproductive or whatever. So why did the management do it? That's something that fascinates me in every country.
Yeah, so there were just people at various points who came in who couldn't bear the lockdowns. There were people who came in because they hadn't been taking their treatment and been sitting at home for a long period. It's strange when you're in a lockdown. You can be going mad for a long time and not be out there and noticed by anyone. So like, it was highly, highly variable. There was an increase in young female self-harm, like that was noticed in lots of places. But I don't think the patterns, there was also a lot of political and financial entrepreneurs in psychiatry and mental health who were like, these lockdowns will cause lots of people to freak out and have mental health problems. So what we need is lots of money so we can help them after the lockdowns freak them out. So there was a lot of that kind of entrepreneurship that occurred, not so much in the public sector. Second question, the management. A lot of my management were scientists, like in the sense of medical doctors and so on. The same things I talked about in my talk were true. The social weight of everything meant that people who knew better, that part of their brain was blocked off to them, and they would say things that were clearly crackpot when you look at the science, and say it to you without blinking, because actually society was doing the right thing and we were stopping the virus, and how great was it? And I don't think you can understand it any other way. Like, I think later on, you could reflect after something else had happened, and they could reflect, oh yeah, that was a crazy rule. But at the time, they were doing the right thing, and isn't that the whole basis of cognitive dissonance? That it's about the contradiction between who you think you are and how what you do is what you are, and the thoughts in your head. Those thoughts take second priority, and new thoughts get put in order to cope with what you're doing.
But I mean, I think there's something more. Also, management gets power from enforcing rules. That's how management gets
But I'm fascinated by this. Like, so as a psychiatrist, tell us, how do we wake these people up?
How do we what?
How do you wake them up? Like, how do you make them realize that they were suffering from
I don't
cognitive?
think you can. I think their experience is going to wake them up. And for some of them, they will never directly consciously process this particular thing, but they will process other stuff, and then in the end, we'll meet people who have kind of in the background ended up processing this. I don't think we can force it, and Klaus said something very powerful to me yesterday. He thinks lots of people inside these institutions who did these things feel tremendously ashamed. You don't fix someone's shame problem by calling them up on their error.
And how long will it take it for them to process it by themselves?
20 years.
I don't. In some sense, I don't think it even matters. What will matter again is what people do. I've been trying to argue what people did mattered more than the thoughts in their heads. People will end up doing something different. They're already doing it, throwing out these governments, revoting Trump, getting rid of Orban. They have started to do these things that will give them a different worldview. These things indicate they're not going back for a rerun of 2020.
I mean, I think that's a really important point. Because by putting Trump and Orban together, we see that there is actually a generalised rejection of the governing class. You know, whoever was in power has pretty much, almost universally, been kicked out, and that's not an accident.
And I'm super angry with Trump because he did that Europe travel ban, and that was one of the most important legitimating kind of things for state intervention. And obviously, pretty soon afterwards, he was like, "Oh God, what have I done? I'm going to get us out of this," and then couldn't because the vortex had started.
Yeah.
And he doesn't deserve to talk about how he's like the freedom dude in that sense. But on the other hand, he opposed like the craziness of continuing it, because Biden and Harris came in and kind of went, yeah, we're going to keep going with this. We're on a winner here. These are the people who'd said initially, I'm not going to take a Trump vaccine, and then forced people to take the Trump vaccine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I got two questions. The one is of course, there is a volatility of opinions. So enthusiasm, and then fear, and then depression. It is ups and downs. It is sort of normal in a society when people are uninformed or underinformed about it, and there are dozens of conspiracy theories going on. So yes, so it's a mass psychology that people buy some information which turns out to be fake, and then some other information. So there was a volatility which was unpredictable in the sphere of opinions. The campaign of 2026 was a COVID topic. No, interestingly, no, it was not even mentioned. This COVID silence continued, which started already in 2022, the previous election, and now the COVID might be a symptom of the dysfunctionality of the regime, but not the real reason for regime change. And science for Orban and his circle was never an independent authority, or if it was, then it was dangerous, so they avoided, and they used as a tool of politicians. If the scientists said something unpleasant, then in a committee, a scientific committee, they replaced the composition of the committee and brought new people, and it's a little bit like Trump actually, on a larger scale. And so the Orban regime, just to make clear, I don't want to enter regime typology or anything like this, it is based on personalism, populism and authoritarianism, a strange combination of the three. All the three were important. Personalism was very important. And relying on elite corruption, which went down to society, relying on traditional mentalities like provincialism, patriarchalism, being proud of knowing nothing about the world, and very heavy propaganda. So it's a very strange combination: corruption, mentalities, propaganda, and not so much ideologies. They mentioned Christianity, nationalism, but their Christianity had nothing to do with Pope Francis or anybody who really represented Christianity. So they were even lecturing Pope Francis about the correct understanding of Christianity, which is quite ridiculous. So 2026, the election was a big relief. Victory of democracy, that is the #1 narrative, April 12th. It's finally, we are happy because the power is back to the people. But also there is another element of happiness which came only after, when Péter Magyar announced the members of his new government. And people said that, well, this is not just the victory of democracy, but the victory of rationality. So finally he managed rationality against madness. So finally he managed to put the right people to the right place. Finally competent people appear in government. What a surprise. So that is also part of the relief. So it's interesting that for the first time there is some enthusiasm about experts, that experts enter the government. That is great. So there is a lot of emotions about this, which never happened before. And I think obviously this will not last forever, but let's just register this unusual moment when expertise, professionalism, technocracy, and democratic enthusiasm are going hand in hand. For a few weeks or 4 months, I don't know.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, Marianne.
I have a question for that. You mentioned this interesting causality that people did something voluntarily, like social distancing, getting into their houses, and then Australian government made it mandatory. This weird. I have the same experience in the Czech Republic when there was great energy. We have to make these cloth masks, and then it was presented, and then government came in and helped by making it mandatory again. It's like a helping hand by making something that was voluntarily to be compulsory, and use I'm in favor of vulgar Marxism. People, politicians get off on power, which I have no issue in that, but I would be maybe expand on it, because I would actually see it as a tool of support. You basically can look a lot of people are doing this one, this measure by themselves. And from my experience, people who follow that measure would be everybody should do that. Everybody should do that measure. So basically, by making it voluntary, by making it mandatory, you would be basically getting support of those people who are doing it, by nature. But just I have a more overriding question: would you expand on this causality? People start to do something by themselves, and then government steps in, and it's everybody has to do it.
Yeah, I think it. Sorry.
No, so Muriel, do you want to add something?
Now I wanted to add another question, but my question would be for András. He can think about it while Tad answers. What is in your book then? You intrigue me. What is in this COVID diary book? If you can describe it a little bit.
Sorry, okay, Tad,
So look, I think it's a general phenomenon. Politicians, in order to gain legitimacy for themselves and their projects, have to ride what is happening in society. They can't, as much as they might want to lift themselves off society, join EU institutions, and never have to worry about what's going on inside the borders of their country with their people again. For example, they can't get away. There's no way they can escape. Ultimately, they are administering a geographically bounded set of people who, even if in situations where people don't vote in dictatorships, they're still administering that group of people within the nation state. And I think therefore politicians sometimes think it's more important when they have, especially when they feel insecure and weak in other ways, to be able to ride some sort of popular mood or so on. So you see it like moral panics, all kinds of different things. This was a different kind of panic, I think, where people retreated to safety, which is, that many plagues and pandemics have led people to hide at home with their families and by themselves. It's just a thing people do when they're not sure what else is going to happen out there in the big bad world. So I think that's really all it is. I was talking to Max about Black Lives Matter 2020 in the United States and elsewhere as we were walking here. There's another example. There is definitely a genuine reaction inside the city after the death of George Floyd from citizens inside that city to have protests, and some of that gets out of control. But then there's a bunch of politicians who I think want to ride it. They withdraw police from certain parts of the city, they allow things to be ransacked, and there's a wider movement amongst politicians to say these protests are legitimate, we want to ride this wave, Nancy Pelosi will take the knee, everyone will take the knee, some of these Minnesota politicians will go and have struggle sessions with the activists. There's actually a riding of a wave of protest. Whatever you think about the causes of the protest originally, politicians then get involved and want to ride it and want to take the leadership of it. And then sometimes they can do that. There are some movements where you can't do that. The dictator in Egypt, when the Tahrir Square protest happened, the dictator in Egypt couldn't ride that movement. That movement ended up riding him out of power. And I think it's important to see that there are different situations that are like that. I think it is a general phenomenon. The yellow vest movement in France, Macron could not ride that movement. And in fact, what we saw in that period, when I put up those protests, we saw more and more protests where the protesters say, you don't represent us, your system is entirely broken, your politics is entirely broken, we're here to say we're staking, this is what we need, we're taking the action to get what we need. And I think that's kind of the counterpoint to politicians being able to successfully ride things. A retreat is the best thing to ride because then actually it's really easy to manage.
Actually, in the case of Macron, he rode the events in the sense that thanks to COVID, and this is one of the reasons why the French COVID measures were so harsh, he managed to break the yellow vest thing.
Yep.
Like, it was also meant as a way, like, the yellow vests are not coming back for several years now because we have COVID. So, like, he kind of exaggerated COVID also because of
we
that.
should mention there the Manifeste Conspirationniste, which is the main thesis. In fact, 2019 saw the largest generalized protests around the world. It was in Chile,
Lebanon,
it was in
the protests in Lebanon were
in
crazy.
France, it was, so that is the thesis of that book. So,
Yeah.
it's,
I think it's just dumb luck they stumbled upon COVID. It's just dumb luck.
András.
Yes, this virus diary was published under the Hungarian name of Vírus Napló. Vírus Napló, if you want to get. I hope
diary.
I have more copies and I can give you one.
Köszönöm
She
szépen.
is able to read in Hungarian. So obviously you deserve a copy. And this is your topic anyway, so I'm stupid to forget to bring a copy. But anyway, also please order it for your institution. And the interesting thing is that it did not make a big impact. So it appeared after COVID, and people did not want to return to COVID, did not want to read about COVID. It was either a lot of negative experiences, bad cases, so they just wanted to watch forward and not looking back. So it was not a popular book at all.
But what is in it? What did you?
What is in it?
Yeah.
Well, it started to describe the state of affairs, the society, the attitude of people, how they behave. But as we progressed, it became increasingly an anti-government and anti-system critique. So finally, COVID was just a starting point to criticize the government. So it became very political as time was passing.
Maybe now is the moment for the book.
Yeah. Actually.
Any last questions? You have a couple of minutes? Yes.
Yes, Professor Bozóki. I would be interested in some of the critiques that you have on the state, and first of all, also on the what was it called? The emergency state.
Yes.
Yes. So, what's your main critique about the regime?
Concerning the state of emergency.
Yes.
If I may add, Aaron is Hungarian and has grown up, as we were discussing before, almost his entire life under Orbán.
Yeah, so we had conversation before, so I know that you are Hungarian. I mean, state of emergency is normal at the time of emergent situation. It's an adequate answer as far as the COVID is concerned. So that was well justified. But my main critique is that after COVID, they put all these extraordinary measures to the constitution. So they normalized it. So what used to be the exception, now it became the norm. So rather than getting rid of this, because the exceptional situation passed, they were just mainstreaming this regulation. And I think they used every opportunity to make power more irresistible.
Yeah.
And I think it was unjustified between 2015 and 2020, and unjustified after COVID. It was justified, but misused during COVID.
Yes. And they already had the 2/3 in the parliament. So what purpose did it really have to have also this emergency state as well? So what purpose did it serve to the legislative or the judiciary and so on? So what were they able to do that they weren't able to do before?
Well, as for today, they will lift these emergency measures, but the danger is still there because the new power has a 2/3 majority again. So that would require an exceptional level of self-control and self-restriction, which is also unprecedented in Hungarian history. That those who are in power control, and for the previous times how before the emergency was, sometimes emergency measures are introduced not to use them directly immediately, but to create an opportunity to expand power when it is necessary.
Okay.
So when Orbán introduced some tough new measures, it didn't mean like in Cambodia in the 70s or Vietnam or China. It was not immediately implemented. It was just to threaten the civil society and the independent organizations.
I mean, presumably, if without the emergency measures, every new thing they would have had to take to Parliament, it would have been much more bureaucratically intensive. Whereas with the emergency measures, they
it is immediately possible for the government to act and governing by decrees without even asking the Parliament.
Yes. Milan, last question.
Yeah, both key papers or pieces focus also on relation between politics and experts, and that mentioned this Marxist perspective that the material conditions create the intellectual sphere. So I was thinking about, and in relation to Muriel's question, the role of management in science and in scientists themselves. we usually imagine politicians as being driven by will to power, but something similar also may apply to scientists. And yesterday we heard the talk of Lauren about sociology of science, and I think we should get rid of this idealized view of scientists as being driven by will to truth. Since of course some of them are driven mainly by will to truth, but they are as corruptible as politicians, and they are driven by will to money, will to power, will to get influence, and the more it applies to management, because good management is, you know, being agreeable to politicians with their money and to private companies. And so let's say this is more of a comment than a question. So will you agree with that in case of Hungary and Australia? And it's also more of a comment to the topic of this conference, since I think we should follow the money as well. Since from the cases, individual cases of scientists I know who, in the beginning of the pandemic, were very critical of lockdowns, were skeptical, were for herd immunity, were, let's say, traditional, saying things openly. They then not changed their mind, but they said something. They were telling something totally different, entirely different. They were for zero COVID policy and things which are absolutely contradictory to what they said previously. And I couldn't find any other explanation that they were simply, you know, willing to get power because it legitimized. Then okay, we will establish a new institute for virology. Then we get more money, and that was a wish of the Academy of Sciences, of universities. Okay, well now that's an opportunity to get more money and more power.
I think we can all think of examples of that in our contexts. And it's a great way to finish the panel, so I want to thank it takes us into the final session very nicely. So thank you.
It was rather a comment, but we had a breakfast and we mentioned that we are not going to talk about Foucault today. but when you mentioned power, money,
no, some of us said we regretted that we didn't speak about
so
Foucault yet.
It came to my mind that we should make a slight little reference to Foucault.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to say very quickly, I'm going to do a bit of advertising. Some of you know there's a conference in London in July, and it's called the British Academy, the COVID-19 Pandemic as a World Historical Event. Some of the people here will be there. It's possible to attend remotely, so I know many of you may not be able to come, but I will circulate the information in case anybody is interested in participating remotely after the event. But anyway, in the meantime,
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's meet at 11.